Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Reardon, president of Minnetonka Audubon Society. Welcome to this evening's program, Wild Stories from the History of Bird Migration Research. Minnetonka wishes to honor the indigenous communities native to the chapter area, including the Pagusset, Wepawag, Quinnipiac, Chatakat, Minnetonka, and Hammonasset people.
Dad, could you help me? Could you come here for a second?
As we advocate for the conservation of the land and its wildlife, we're indebted to the work of the native and indigenous people who cherished the land for thousands of years before European colonization. We have two programs coming up in March. On March 11th, that's a Tuesday, we'll have a talk about the Connecticut National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is in the eastern Long Island Sound area. And on Wednesday, March 26th, program on bird-friendly maple. That'll be really cool. Tonight's speaker, Rebecca Heisman, is an award-winning science writer who lives in Walla Walla, Washington. She's worked with National Audubon, American Bird Conservancy, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and the American Ornithological Society. So she's got a lot of experience with birds, and it's intrigued her enough to look into the bird migration. And we'll welcome her tonight. During the presentation, please have yourself muted, put questions in the chat, and or save them for the end of the program, and we'll let you unmute yourself and ask your questions. Meanwhile, Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you. I'm gonna get started with sharing my screen here. All right. All right, success. Hopefully you can just see my slide and not my notes. It took me a while to figure out how to set that up. So yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much for having me tonight. And I'm thank you for letting me reschedule from December. I was getting over an illness and it really would not have been fun to have me talking on Zoom for an hour while losing my voice. So I'm glad that I can do it tonight. I'm happy we could make this work. And yeah, I'm here tonight all the way from Walla Walla because I am the author of a book that came out almost 2 years ago now called Flight Paths, which is a popular science book looking at the history of how scientists have figured out bird migration over time, which is a surprisingly interesting and rich and entertaining subject. So I spent probably 2 years of my life immersed in this topic. I read more scientific papers than I could possibly count. I spoke with dozens of scientists, including lots of ornithologists, but also a surprising number of engineers, computer scientists, folks like that. I got to join a few of those ornithologists in the field and shadow them while they were carrying out their research. And it was just an amazing experience. And I feel really privileged to get to tell the stories of some of the scientists who are profiled in this book. I still feel like they are the real experts, and I'm just here trying to bring the amazing things that they're doing to a wider audience. And that is a really fun job to have because there are just so many good stories to tell about bird migration. So these are just a few of the amazing migrators whose stories appear in my book. On the left, this is a bar-tailed godwit. This is the famous bird that in the fall makes a nonstop flight across the Pacific Ocean from Alaska to the vicinity of New Zealand without touching down once. It's the longest known nonstop migratory flight. In the middle, this is a bar-headed goose. These guys make what's probably the world's highest altitude bird migration. They fly back and forth over the Himalayan mountains in Asia every year. And in the upper right, this little guy, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is a blackpoll warbler. They, in the fall, to get from their wintering grounds in New England down, or sorry, their breeding grounds in New England down to their wintering grounds in northern South America, they just launched themselves out from New England and spent 3 days flying over the open water of the Atlantic Ocean, which sounds less impressive than a godwit spending a week crossing the Pacific, but you got to remember that a godwit is about the size of a football, and a blackpoll warbler weighs about the same as a ballpoint pen. So it's really just astonishing. But for me, what fascinates me just as much as what migrating birds do and how they do it is how we figured all of this out. How do we even know that this is happening? So that's what my book is really about, and that's what I'm here to talk a little bit about this evening. Before I totally dive into that, I wanted to give just a little bit more background about me and how I came to write this book. So before COVID, which is a long time ago now, but I had a full-time job working for the American Ornithological Society, which is the big professional organization for bird scientists in America. And I was their one-person communications department. So I wore a lot of hats, but a big part of my role was promoting the new scientific research that was being published in their two peer-reviewed journals, which are what you see here, the Auk and the Condor. They've changed the names now, but they were called the Auk and the Condor. And so I was reading a lot of scientific papers and talking to a lot of the scientists who'd written them and sort of translating them into press releases and blog posts and so forth. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with like the format of a scientific paper, but they all follow the same basic structure, right? There's an introduction where the researchers kind of lay out what they were trying to study and like make a case for why it's an interesting question, why this was something worth looking at. And then there's the methods where they go through the steps of how they collected their data, what exactly they did. And then there's the results and the discussion where they're talking about what they found and kind of why it matters and where we might go next. And so I was reading all these papers and I kept getting sucked into and fascinated by the part that I think a lot of people just kind of skim through to get to the good stuff, which is the methods section. I loved these method sections. I didn't know, or if I had learned in my college ornithology class, I had forgotten that you can study bird migration using weather radar. You can study bird migration by putting out microphones to passively record the calls of birds passing overhead at night. You can study bird migration by analyzing rare hydrogen isotopes in bird feathers. I'm not even going to get into that one tonight, but it's just wild. And so at some point I started thinking, who even came up with all of this? Like, who figured out that this was possible and made it work? And so when I ended up leaving that job around the beginning of the pandemic, I decided to turn that question into a book proposal. And that's the book that I'm here to talk about this evening. All right, so I cover a lot of ground in the book. This is the table of contents. Basically, what I did was I just went through chapter by chapter each of the major methods that scientists have developed over time to kind of track the long distance movements of birds, roughly in chronological order. So starting with the origins of scientific bird banding over a century ago and going all the way up through the latest like high-tech miniaturized satellite transmitters and stuff like that. But there's no way I could cram all of this into a 45-minute book talk. So when I first started getting asked to give talks like this about 2 years ago now, I decided that the most fun way to do it would be to just zoom in on three of my favorite stories from the book and share those. And so that's what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to talk about three of my favorite migration innovators who I learned about in the course of researching this book, and then end with talking a little bit about why this all matters for bird conservation. And my hope is that you will come away from this evening with a new appreciation of all of the hard work and creativity that went into uncovering every gee whiz fact that you hear about bird migration. Okay, so the first tactic for figuring out what migratory birds are doing that I want to talk about is one that I had not even heard of before I started doing the research for this book, and that is moon watching. So most songbirds migrate at night, and that means that if you want to observe their behavior on migration, you need to get pretty creative because not only are they flying overhead pretty high up, so it's dark outside, but it's also dark outside, so you can't just look up and see what they're up to. And today we have all sorts of high-tech tools like radar and satellites to help us spy on these night migrating birds. But before any of that technology was developed, this guy, whose name was George Lowry, came up with a really clever way to do it using just a telescope. So, George Lowry was born in Louisiana in 1913, and he was an avid, obsessive birder from a very young age. In 1936, he finished his master's degree from the University of Louisiana, or Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. And he stayed on there as an instructor and an ornithologist for the rest of his career. And he helped found the university's Museum of Zoology, which is still going strong today. Now, growing up along the coast of Louisiana and being a very avid birder, George Lowry would have been familiar with the phenomenon of migratory fallout. And so this is when birds that are migrating north in the spring, a lot of them cross the Gulf of Mexico. And depending on the weather conditions, they will basically, sometimes they will basically fall out of the sky en masse at the first little bit of land that they get to in North America. And so when conditions are right, you can get these incredible concentrations of every sort of migratory songbird just like dripping from the trees and, the first grove of trees behind the beach. And although there really wasn't any way to prove it at this point in time, a lot of ornithologists in the early 20th century, George Lowry included, thought that it was likely that migrating birds crossed over the open water of the Gulf of Mexico on a regular basis, that this was just a normal part of bird migration. But then in the 1940s, a guy named George Williams, our second George of the evening, it was a popular name for mid-century biologists, so George number two comes along and says, hang on, this makes no sense. Why would all of these birds voluntarily fly all the way across the Gulf when Mexico is right there? He's like, they got to be taking the land route. It's the only thing that makes sense. That's where they must be. We're just not looking hard enough for them there. Now, George Lowry, George number one, having seen the evidence, the admittedly circumstantial evidence of trans-Gulf migration with his own eyes, was really annoyed by this. And these two men had quite the heated back and forth in the scientific journals of the day about this. George Lowry started casting around, trying to think of some technique that he could use to prove George Williams wrong. And he remembered some quirky papers that he had read from the very, very early years of the 20th century, where folks had described looking at the full moon through a telescope during bird migration season and being able to see the silhouettes of these night migrating birds passing in front of the disk of the full moon. And Lowry thought, that's interesting. I bet I could do something with that. Now, luckily for Lowry, there happened to be an astronomy professor at LSU at this time who was also a really enthusiastic bird watcher. So Lowry and this astronomer put their heads together, and they managed to come up with a set of equations that would let Lowry take raw data, a raw count of the number of birds that he saw passing in front of the moon in a given amount of time, and do some math and turn this into an estimate of the total number of birds crossing an imaginary 1-mile line on the Earth's surface at that location every hour. Now, this sounds pretty abstract, and it is, but basically what this means is Lowry had now had a way to actually measure and quantify how much bird migration was happening at one time and place with how much bird migration was happening at another time and place. And there hadn't really been a good way to do that before. Lowry dubbed this the migration traffic rate, and he thought with this he finally had a tool to demonstrate just the sheer volume of birds passing over the Gulf of Mexico. So, April 1945, Lowry packs up a telescope, he gets on a boat, headed across the Gulf for a port on the Yucatan Peninsula. The first night, he's so excited, he's like, okay, here I go, I'm going to prove George number two wrong. He goes up on deck after dark, he sets up his telescope on the deck of this ship, he points it at the moon, and he looks into the eyepiece. George Lowry did not have any experience at sea, and he had failed to anticipate the fact that as viewed through the telescope eyepiece, the moon would be bobbing up and down continuously with the motion of the waves, in and out of sight, making it impossible to get an accurate count. But George Lowry was not a man who gave up easily, so he waited until the boat docked in the Yucatan where the water was calmer, and he tried again. And pointing his telescope out at the moon, rising over the Gulf, he tallied 12 birds in 45 minutes. That may not sound like very much, but when he did the math, that turned out to be equivalent to more than 3,700 birds passing over a 1 mile line extending out into the Gulf from that spot every hour. So George Lowry had just collected the first hard numerical evidence that large-scale trans-Gulf migration was a real phenomenon. Take that, George number 2. Now, Lowry knew he was onto something. He was just getting started with moon watching. His next idea was that he could scale this up and he could recruit volunteers from all across North America to collect this type of data, and he could create the first ever continent-wide snapshot of bird migration patterns. But this was going to be a huge undertaking. There was no way Lowry could do it alone. Luckily for him, an enthusiastic young graduate student arrived at LSU right about this time. So this is Lowry again on the left. And then on the right here, we have our new character who's entering the story, which is Bob Newman. Now, this is clearly not Bob Newman as an enthusiastic young graduate student, but it turns out in the pre-smartphone era, there weren't a lot of photos published of people until they got famous later in their career. So I could not find a photo of young Bob Newman. You'll have to use your imagination. Like Lowry, Bob Newman arrived at LSU as a graduate student and ended up staying there the whole rest of his career. And Lowry and Newman formed a working partnership that lasted all the way until Lowry's death in the 1970s. Now, both of these men passed away decades ago, so I was not able to interview either of them when I was doing the research for my book. But I did talk to an ornithologist now in his 80s who worked with both of them when he was a graduate student and shared some of his memories of both of these men. And my impression is that in a lot of ways, they couldn't be more different. They were sort of the odd couple of ornithology. Lowry was an old school gentleman naturalist who wore a suit and tie for field work and organized expeditions into the jungle to collect more specimens for his museum. He was apparently a workaholic who would go home to eat dinner with his wife only to reappear in the office in the evening to get a little more work done. Bob Newman, our young newcomer, was a jokester. He had a reputation for his sense of humor. And he also approached problems much more like a modern scientist. So Bob Newman taught himself statistics before that was a common skill for zoologists. You didn't actually need to know stats to be a professional biologist at this time. And he also made it a personal mission to keep up with the latest bird migration research being published all over the world. Together, these two men came up with a plan to collect a snapshot of migration activity across the whole continent during a single week in October. You can do moon watching for a few days on either side of the full moon. It doesn't have to be the exact day of the full moon. Now, no one had ever tried anything like this before. And to organize this whole thing, it was going to be a massive job. You have to remember this was before the internet. It was basically before computers. Like there were probably a couple primitive computers in the United States at this time, but these two guys sure did not have access to them. So the way they started all this was they spent literally up to 12 hours a day handwriting hundreds of letters to potential volunteers all across the country, targeting a lot of local Audubon chapters like you guys mainly. Explaining the goals of their project and what would be required of data collectors and the special contribution that each participant would be making to science. And they eventually were able to recruit 2,500 volunteers in 325 locations from Canada to Panama who were willing to try pointing a telescope at the moon and recording what they saw. This is a total side note, but once I gave this talk and at the end when it was question time, this little old man stood up and raised his hand and said, I was one of those data collectors in 1952. So that was a really cool moment. All right. Oh, yeah, I almost forgot about this part. So I mentioned that Bob Newman had a reputation for his sense of humor. They printed up how-to pamphlets to mail out to all of their volunteers. This is an actual illustration from one of their how-to pamphlets to accompany some tips for staying comfortable for long stints of staring up at the sky. I just thought this was too funny not to include. I really like the cigar and the loud pants. I can't decide if this was supposed to be funny or if it was just the 50s. But anyway, in fall 1952, telescopes finally swung into action across North America. Pretty soon, observations were flooding into LSU from every corner of the continent. Paper data sheets mailed in from every part of the country were stacking up higher and higher and higher on Lowry and Newman's desks. And they realized that they had a new problem, one which they should have thought more about ahead of time, which is how they were going to analyze all of this data. Again, no computers. This is before most zoologists had any training in statistics. They now needed to calculate the average direction and volume of bird migration from each of these hundreds of locations. They wanted to look for connections with weather patterns, so they had to look up data on temperature and wind and the movement of cold fronts for each of those locations in printed books of weather records, which is a thing that they used to put out. And then they had to depict all of this on easy to interpret maps, which they would have to draw by hand. It took them 14 years to complete and publish this analysis. Finally, in 1966, their magnum opus appeared in the ornithological journal, The Auk, which is one of the same journals that I would be working for about 50 years later. They titled it A Continent-Wide View of Bird Migration on 4 Nights in October. And it was filled with page after page of these painstakingly crafted maps where they used these different colored arrows to indicate the direction and volume of bird migration at locations across the continent on the nights of October 1st through 4th, 1952. And you could see laid out on these maps how in the Midwest and East there were these massive migratory flights that spanned multiple states. You could see how favorable winds and the movement of cold fronts affected migration patterns across the continent, with the heaviest migration occurring in front of these advancing cold fronts. I feel like today, when we're all so used to seeing, radar images and satellite images and whatnot, it's almost hard to imagine how like mind-blowing this must have been at the time for birders and ornithologists to see all of this laid out at the scale of the whole country like this. This paper was a blockbuster. It was 40 pages long. It influenced studies of bird migration for years to come. It was also the last moon-watching paper that Lowry and Newman would ever publish together, because a new technology developed by one of their students was about to make pretty much all of this obsolete. And that was radar. So I'm sure some of you have seen an image like this before. This was taken from the nationwide weather radar system. This is the same one that you see images from on the Weather Channel to show you where precipitation is happening. And you can see some rain on this map. Those sort of irregular green blobs down the East Coast are rainstorms. But all of the big round blue blobs that you can see, blue blobs, that's a tongue twister, that you can see over large parts of the continent, those are birds. Now they generally filter migrating birds and other distractions out of the radar images that they use for TV weather reports. But birds actually show up really well on radar. And during migration season, these big waves of birds moving across the continent show up as the sort of donut-shaped blobs that you see here. And basically what you're seeing is each of those round blobs represents the field of view of one individual radar station. And as the birds are lifting off in the evening for their night of flying, there's so many of them that they can just completely saturate each radar's, field of view so that you get these completely filled in round circles like this. Now, when people first started using radar in an organized way, it hadn't really occurred to anyone yet that they might pick up birds. They weren't looking for birds. They weren't looking for rainstorms either. They were looking for Nazi planes. So to get a little bit technical, really, really briefly here, radar stands for radio detection and ranging. And basically the way it works, you can think of it as being like sonar or echolocation, but using radio waves instead of sound. So you're beaming out radio waves, they're bouncing off out there and coming back, and the energy that comes back tells you something about what's out there and what direction it's in and how far away it is. Now, British scientists had figured all of this out by the 1930s. And so by the time World War II really got going, they had built radar stations up and down the British coast to detect incoming planes coming from the European mainland. But pretty much as soon as these radar stations were operational, they started picking up some weird things. So they kept seeing these mysterious signals like planes as viewed on these radar systems would kind of plod along at consistent speeds and trajectories, but they were seeing these blips that like waxed and waned and changed direction at random. They couldn't figure out what they were looking at. Supposedly, at one point, a red alert was sounded, and British fighter planes were urgently ordered into the air to intercept strange signals heading across the English Channel, only to find nothing there. And so the exasperated radar operators started calling these radar angels. You guys see where this is going, I hope. All right, so while all of this was happening, this guy, whose name was David Lack, had been teaching science at a secondary school in Devonshire in southwestern England. And he didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the father of radar ornithology. Now, once again, David Lack was a young man in the time period that we're talking about here. This is him later in his career. There aren't any photos of young David Lack out there, sorry. David Lack had always been interested in birds. He studied ornithology at Cambridge before becoming a teacher. And in 1938, he actually took a year off from his teaching job to travel to the Galapagos Islands to study Darwin's famous finches there. He got back to the UK just as the war was heating up, and David Lack later wrote a partial memoir about the early years of his career. So I'm going to read you a little bit in his own words what happened next as he arrived back in England at the beginning of World War II. I had become a pacifist at the age of 17, so he'd signed a pledge to some anti-war organization. And in the autumn of 1940, I decided that I ought to leave my job at the school to work with a pacifist unit. I spent a trial night in the East End of London during heavy raids, but was so put off by the pacifist earnest attitudes and so excited by the flashes and bangs that I was immediately converted from pacifism. A month later, the Central Register for Scientific Workers sent me to interview for an unspecified job. So he's going to join the war effort, but because he's got a science background, they want to give him a science job. As a biologist, you will of course have learned a lot of physics, the interviewer said. I'm afraid not, I answered. Well, I expect your maths is of a high standard. I'm afraid not. Then very doubtfully, I fear this job will often entail going out in the wet and cold in the dark. Would you mind that? Not at all. So I was taken on and 10 days later set off from London with 19 other biologists on a mystery coach tour. And yes, if you couldn't guess, they put him to work on radar systems because apparently any science background at all was good enough to get you work on radar systems at this time. Lack was first posted to the Orkneys, which are a wet, windy, remote group of islands off the north end of Scotland. I gather he was just about the only person happy to be sent there because the birding was really good. He got to spend all his off hours scrambling around on the rocks looking for puffins and skuas. But it was after that, on a tour of radar installations up and down the coast, that he was reintroduced to an old acquaintance of his named George Varley, our third and final biologist George of the evening. Varley had been a classmate of Lack's from Cambridge, and he had actually been an entomologist before the war, so he was a bug guy, but now he also was working on radar. And it was Varley who introduced Lack to the mystery of the so-called angels that were plaguing the radar operators. Now, Lack had a background in ornithology. He was familiar with the behavior of birds in flight. He heard the descriptions of the radar angels, and he pretty much immediately was like, guys, it's birds. No one believed him. Everyone said that this was impossible. So Lack and Varley decided that they would join forces and see if they could prove that this is what was going on. At one point, they convinced an officer to tie a dead gull to a balloon and send it up into the air in front of a radar station just to demonstrate that it was possible for a bird body to produce a radar signal. Finally, in September 1941, they managed to use a powerful telescope to confirm that the source of a signal being tracked offshore in real time was in fact a flock of gannets, the seabirds that you see here. And so as the war continued, they kept collecting radar observations that they believed represented birds. Radar technology was advancing all the time, so pretty soon they were able to pick up smaller birds like flocks of starlings and stuff. They continued to gather data to confirm that the behavior of the characteristics of the so-called angels were consistent with the behavior of birds in flight. Not everyone was convinced. And so just because I like David Lack's sense of humor so much, I want to read you one more brief quote from him describing his and Varley's efforts to convince others that this is what was going on. At one meeting, he wrote, After the physicists had again gravely explained that clouds of ions must be responsible, Varley, with equal gravity, accepted their view, providing that the ions were wrapped in feathers. David Lack was snarky. I really like it. All right, so they stuck with it, and in 1945, as the end of the war neared, they finally got permission to publish their previously top secret findings in the journal Nature. And today, Lack, who died in 1973, is better remembered for a book that he wrote about Darwin's finches. But this publication essentially kicked off the whole subdiscipline that is now known as radar ornithology. Radar ornithology might have remained a footnote in my book instead of a whole chapter, if not for the fact that after World War II, meteorologists started adapting radar at large scales, as you all know. So meteorologists jumped on this technology as a way to provide early warnings about hurricanes and other major storms. Large flocks of birds showed up just as well on weather radar as they had on military radar, and so building a nationwide network of radar systems was great news for ornithologists who wanted to look at large-scale migration patterns. And over time, as we've had advances like Doppler technology, this has just become a better and better way to gather information about these migration patterns, and it's still a major data source used by ornithologists today. To be clear, when you're looking at these radar images of migrating bird flocks, you don't necessarily know what individual species you're looking at. You're just sort of seeing the overall density of birds in the air. So I wanted to talk briefly about one sort of modern paper that I think gives you a sense of what you can do with this type of data. This is from a paper that was published back in 2018. Two scientists affiliated with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology downloaded Weather Service radar scans covering the whole continent over every evening from the past 23 years, so more than 150,000 individual radar images. And they analyzed them to see how weather factors like temperature and wind and air pressure predicted the appearance of big migration movements on radar. Because, we think of migration as being a season that goes on for weeks, but it's not like there's an equal number of birds in the sky every night. There's big nights and quiet nights. And so they wanted to see what factors were related to those big nights. They found that this math, looking at weather factors, explained almost 80% of the variation in migration intensity from one night to the next. So 80% of this variation was down to the weather. And that by using this and looking at the weather, they could actually then predict several days in advance when big migratory movements were going to happen. And so if any of you are familiar with Birdcast, this amazing tool from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology where you can log in during migration and get a forecast of how many birds are going to be passing through your area that night, this is actually the technology that Birdcast is based on. And it is all thanks to a witty science teacher from Devonshire who figured out what was really going on with those mysterious angels annoying the radar operators guarding England from the Nazis. But, of course, radar is not the only way to put radio waves to work tracking birds. And this brings me to my third favorite final migration innovator of the evening. Excuse me. All right, so this guy's name is Bill Cochran. I actually have a photo of young Bill Cochran. It's a miracle. Young Bill Cochran on the left, older Bill Cochran on the right here, same guy. So in the mid-1950s, Bill Cochran was a Navy veteran working on an electrical engineering degree part-time while working for a brand new television station based in Champaign, Illinois. One morning, he went out to check on his employer's transmitter tower on the outskirts of town, and there he found an ornithologist from the University of Illinois and his wife picking up dead birds off the ground. Cochran apparently found this very interesting and started peppering the ornithologist with questions about what he was doing there and why he was so interested in these dead birds. It turns out that the man's name was Richard Graber. He worked for the Illinois Natural History Survey, and he was studying tower kills, which are this phenomenon which would have been fairly new at the time, where flocks of birds fly into communications towers and are killed by the impact. Cochran was really intrigued by the fact that there was this guy out there studying birds, and soon he was spending all of his spare time kind of tinkering together gadgets that Graber could use in his research. Now, Bill Cochran appears in more chapters of my book than any other one scientist, The first project that he and Graeber worked on together was they were actually the first folks to record the nocturnal flight calls of migrating birds. So a lot of these night migrating songbirds, they make these unique calls at night that they don't make when they're flying at night that they don't make at other times. And so Graeber and Cochrane were the first to actually make recordings of these calls. And one of my favorite little anecdotes from the whole book is Bill Cochrane, the electrical engineering student, figuring out how to rig up a tape recorder with bicycle axles to hold these 6,000 feet of tape that they would need to record an entire 8-hour night of birds passing overhead. But the chapter in my book where Bill Cochrane looms the largest by far is the one on radio telemetry. So, I skipped ahead there. This is where I was supposed to be. Okay, so telemetry is just a fancy way to say transmitting data from one place to another in real time. And there were two technological advances right around this time that really helped kick off the field of radio telemetry. The first was the invention of the transistor in 1947. So this is actually a picture of a replica of the first transistor. I think I'm the only person going around giving talks to Audubon chapters with a photo of the first transistor in my PowerPoint. But anyway, before this, radios relied on bulky, breakable vacuum tubes to amplify the signals that they sent out. And to take something very technical and boil it down, basically transistors provided a lightweight, efficient, durable, much more reliable way of doing the same thing. And among many, many other applications, they made it possible to adapt radios for all sorts of tasks that they wouldn't have been suited for before, including transmitting sensitive data from place to place. Sorry. All right, so one of the first groups to jump on this and start experimenting with radio telemetry was actually the US Navy. In no time, they were trying things like using radio signals to transmit real-time data on a jet pilot's vital signs to a doctor monitoring them from the ground, and to study the effectiveness of cold water suits for sailors by beaming out temperature data from inside the suits. But it did not take long for wildlife researchers to begin borrowing these ideas. Really, my whole book is a history of ornithologists being really, really good at borrowing advances from other fields and co-opting them to use for studying birds. So in 1957, some scientists in Antarctica used the system from the cold water suit tests to remotely monitor the temperature of a penguin egg during incubation. That's what's happening here. That's a penguin being manhandled in the lower right-hand corner. And that same year, a group of researchers in Maryland borrowed some ideas from the Jet Pilot project and surgically implanted transmitters in woodchucks to track their movements around a little nature preserve. Soon, big companies like Honeywell were getting involved in this, trying to design radio tracking systems that they could sell to wildlife biologists to use to track animals' movements. But they were basically doing things like strapping a metal box containing radio equipment onto the back of a grouse and releasing this grouse into the bushes and wishing it well. A grouse with a metal box strapped to it is not going to last very long, and so it was tricky to make this actually work in the field. So before radio telemetry could really take off, someone was going to have to think outside the box, ha, 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 and that someone was going to turn out to be Bill Cochrane. Now, I did say two technological advances. I talked about the transistor. The second thing that really played into all of this was the launch of Sputnik. Yes, not only the transistor, here is an illustration of Sputnik. So Sputnik 1 was launched in 1957. This was, of course, the world's first artificial satellite launched by the Soviets. Basically, all this thing did was circle the Earth and beep. But if you had a radio receiver and you knew what you were doing, you could pick up this beep from space from pretty much anywhere on Earth. And people were fascinated by this. And it touched off a whole new wave of interest in radios and what they could do. So by 1960, Bill Cochrane, who still had not actually finished that electrical engineering degree, but was apparently really good with transistors, had picked up more part-time work helping a University of Illinois astronomer build radio beacons for some of the first US satellites that were going to be launched in response to Sputnik. Actually, some of the first US spy satellites, although they did not know at the time that that's what they were working on. Cochrane was also still doing work with Graeber and his colleagues over at the Illinois Natural History Survey, and eventually someone suggested that they try combining Cochrane's two part-time gigs. Like, hey, Bill, what do you think would happen if we put one of your radio gadgets on a duck? I don't know, sounds fun, let's try it. So they sent over a duck from the field station on the Illinois River to the satellite laboratory. They strapped a transmitter onto this bird using a metal band that went around its chest. And although they had not planned this, it turned out that the bird's breathing distorted the band in a way that affected the radio signal, so that when they released the duck, they could track its respiratory rate as it flew, accidentally collecting the very first data on the physiology of a bird in flight. And they all got a nice publication out of it. So that moment, when that duck took off wearing a transmitter that Bill Cochrane had built, something clicked for him, and he realized that this was what he wanted to spend his life doing, was building radio transmitters for wild animals. Now, building a radio transmitter to be worn by an animal requires making a lot of trade-offs. A longer antenna will give you a stronger signal. A bigger battery will give you a longer lasting tag, but those both add weight, which you don't want. And so Cochrane, who wouldn't officially finish that electrical engineering degree for several more years until the Illinois Natural History Survey told him they couldn't continue employing him if he didn't finish his remaining credits, turned out to be really good at getting this balance just right. He favored designs that were as small and simple and compact as possible. And instead of putting all of the components in a metal box, he figured out how to kind of dip the whole assembly into plastic resin to seal and waterproof everything together. Now, excuse me, one of his first gigs doing this was building transmitters for a local biologist who wanted a better way to survey the cottontail rabbit population in the area. But pretty soon word got out of what Bill Cochrane was able to do, and biologists all over the country were clamoring for his services. Pretty soon he was building transmitters small enough that they could safely be placed on a good-sized songbird. And this was great news for his old friend and mentor, the ornithologist Richard Graeber, because he studied thrushes, which are, fairly large songbirds compared to a warbler or something like that. And he was interested in learning more about their migratory behavior. But these devices, they only had a range of a few miles. And so to use one to follow a bird on migration, you literally had to follow the bird on migration. So in 1965, Richard Graeber, the ornithologist, found a pilot who was willing to try following a migrating radio-tagged thrush at night in a small plane. May 1965, they capture a gray-cheeked thrush outside Urbana, Illinois. They trim the feathers from a little patch on its back, and they stick on a transmitter using eyelash glue, the same stuff we would use to attach false eyelashes for makeup, which is popular for this because it's non-toxic and doesn't irritate the skin, and it wears off on its own after a while. They waited for dusk when the bird took off for its night of flying, and then they picked up the signal and took off and began to follow it in this plane, Graeber and the pilot. And that night they followed this bird north for more than 400 miles before turning back, 200 of which were over the open water of Lake Michigan. Now, they wouldn't have been able to see the bird. They would have just been flying through the dark night in this little plane, sitting in the cockpit, listening to this wavering beep, beep, beep on the radio of this bird out in front of them somewhere in the night. But Graeber was so awed by this experience and by his understanding of what it was that this small bird was accomplishing, that when he wrote about this for Audubon magazine later, he compared it to how he felt watching the television coverage of the Apollo moon missions. And Bill Cochrane, our electrical engineer, was just getting started. 1973, Cochrane and a student named Charles Welling tag another thrush passing through Illinois in the spring. And this time they spend a full week following this bird almost 1,000 miles, all the way across the Canadian border and up into Manitoba in a station wagon with a hole cut in the top for their radio receiver. I read the little 2-page paper that reported on what they did, and my jaw just dropped. I couldn't believe that people used to do stuff like this. Apparently, they had some adventures along the way, which were not covered in the very dry 2-page scientific paper. At one point, Charles Welling, the student who was along to help drive, basically spent a night in jail because a suspicious police officer pulled them over in rural Minnesota, who wouldn't be suspicious of this thing driving through your small rural Minnesota town in the middle of the night? And Cochrane didn't want to stop for too long for fear of losing the bird's signal, so he basically kicked Welling out of the car to sort things out, kept on driving until the bird set down at dawn, where he knew he'd be able to find it again later, doubled back, bailed Welling out, and on they went. As they went, they gathered data on the bird's altitude, its airspeed and ground speed, the distance it covered each night, and the precise heading that it set out on each evening. And because they were able to stick with this bird over such a long distance, Cochrane and Welling were actually able to track how the precise direction that the bird set out in each night changed as its position changed relative to magnetic north, which provided some of the first real world evidence that migrating songbirds use some sort of internal magnetic compass as one of their tools for navigation. They were finally forced to stop when the car's engine gave out after they crossed into Canada, or who knows how far they would have gotten. Now, Bill Cochrane never really got the hang of the politics of academia or of the peer review system for scientific publishing. He always remained a little bit of an outsider. And I think he may not have been the easiest guy to get along with on like a personal level either. He was married 3 times. And by the late 1990s, he had left the Illinois Natural History Survey on what I gather were less than good terms. He was butting heads with a lot of people there by then. But he kept building radio systems for ornithologists in his garage right into the beginning of this century. I feel like each time I've given this talk for an audience that had ornithologists in it, someone has a Bill Cochrane story. Like there's someone else who worked with Bill Cochrane and has another wild tale of something that he did. I actually had the great good fortune to speak to Bill multiple times while I was researching my book and even to visit him at his home in Illinois, where this station wagon was still in the driveway and most of his backyard was taken up with an enormous radio receiver tower. He was a hilarious character. He loved to screen his phone calls by pretending to be a janitor at an animal shelter. So I would call him at a prearranged time for a phone interview, and he would pick up and go, "Hello, animal shelter, we're closed." Be like, Bill? Bill, is that you? It's Rebecca. So it was a great honor to get to meet this guy. Sadly, he passed away in 2022 at the age of 90. And I really believe that he is an unsung hero of 20th century science. And I'm really happy that my book is hopefully making more people aware of all of the things that he accomplished. All right, so I've been talking and talking. I promise I'm coming to the end of my talk here. In my last few minutes, like I said earlier, I want to talk about why this matters for migratory bird conservation. I did want to mention I chose historical stories from the book for this talk on purpose. As I said, I've given this talk to audiences of ornithologists, and I didn't want to find myself in the position of talking about someone who was in the audience. That seemed like it would be really awkward, so I intentionally chose stories of people who I knew had passed away. So if you get a chance to read the whole book, I promise to be blunt about it. It's not all dead white guys. I talk about a lot of them, you'll meet a lot of women and people from all over the world who are doing this type of work now. And I also cover the more recent developments in this field, like the latest miniaturized tracking devices and artificial intelligence tools for analyzing big data sets and high volume genetic sequencing, all that sort of stuff. And so thanks to all of these recent high-tech advances, we now have a clearer, more detailed picture of bird migration than ever before. That data can help us target conservation efforts more effectively, and that's a good thing because migratory birds are kind of in trouble. Some of you might have seen the media coverage of this paper when it came out back in 2019. It was dubbed the 3 Billion Birds paper, and it generated some headlines when it was published. What this is a large group of ornithologists looked at a whole bunch of different data sources and came up with this estimate that there are about 2.9 billion, with a B, fewer breeding birds in North America now than there were in 1970. So this is just a staggering loss, and researchers and wildlife managers have been scrambling to figure out how to stop the bleeding. And so when it came time to write the conclusion for my book and try to tie a bow on this whole thing, I wanted to tackle the question of whether some of these new cutting edge tracking technologies might provide part of the answer, and also just whether there's any reason to feel hopeful when we look at numbers like this. And so one thing I did was I got in touch with a couple of the leading experts on migratory bird conservation and asked them what they thought. So I spoke with Pete Mara, who was one of the senior authors on this paper and co-founder of the Road to Recovery initiative that's grown out of it. He's now at Georgetown University. And I also talked to Jill Deppy, who's the director of the Audubon Society's Migratory Bird Initiative. So I called both of them up and I asked them laughably broad questions like, what is the state of migratory bird conservation today? And are you hopeful about the future? And they had strikingly similar things to say. They agreed that despite all the ever more detailed migration research that is happening now, we still need more data to understand what's behind the declines of many of these species. So I think some people might feel like there's an argument to be made that we need to be directing all of our resources to conservation, that the time for basic data collection is over and we just need to shift gears and focus on conservation. But the truth is that for a lot of birds, we still don't know enough about them to know why their numbers are declining, which means we don't know enough to be able to fix it yet. They also agreed that there's a need to consolidate the data that is being collected and do a better job of getting it into the hands of policymakers and conservation activists, to get better at working across international borders, to incorporate more partners in the social sciences and more perspectives from Indigenous people. And somewhat to my surprise, they both insisted that yes, there is still reason for hope. So I'm going to close by reading a little of what Pete Mara said when I asked him if he feels hopeful about the future. He said, "I'm very optimistic. We've done this in the past, we've corrected other environmental issues, and now we have to deal with climate change. So while it seems like there's this overwhelming deluge of negative issues and challenges with getting people on board with these things and constant pressures on nature, I choose to be optimistic and hopeful because I don't see any benefit of being pessimistic or having a lack of hope. I just don't choose to take that route. Don't get me wrong, there are times when I might be negative or spiraling down into a pit of agony, but I'm not going to do that." I thought those were wise words, and I don't know about all of you, but when I find myself spiraling down into a pit of agony, I usually go birding. So that's the conclusion of my talk. If I can do a little self-promotion really briefly, again, here's my book, Flight Paths. It actually comes out in paperback in about 2 weeks. So if you prefer your books in the less expensive paperback form, that is going to be an option very, very, very shortly. This is my website, RebeccaHeisman.com. There's two relevant things that you'll find there. The first is a contact form that goes straight to my email inbox. And if anyone does feel motivated to go out and buy a copy of the book after hearing this talk, I still have just a few book plate stickers left. So if you email me via that contact form and say that you bought a copy of the book after hearing this talk, I'd love to put one of these in the mail for you so that you can turn it into a signed copy. And the other thing that you'll find there is my monthly email newsletter. I get asked all the time if I'm working on a second book, and the answer is not yet, but I do a lot of other freelance writing about birds. And so you can sign up for this monthly email that has anything that I'm writing or working on, and also just links to interesting bird news from around the web and book recommendations and stuff like that. So I'd encourage you to go check that out if that's something you might be interested in. And yeah, I would love to take some questions.
Thanks, Rebecca. Great presentation. Any questions? Raise your hand, go off mute. Yes. Carl.
Rebecca, are you getting involved in the Motus Tower research?
There's a whole chapter in the book about Motus. Motus is very cool. For anyone who's not familiar with this is another form of radio tracking where they put up whole networks of towers to pick up birds flying by. I'm not personally involved in it, other than the fact that I interviewed some of the people who run it for the book and wrote about how it was developed. I will say though, my husband is a ham radio enthusiast, and he has been dabbling in putting up a Modus receiver in our backyard, although he has not picked up anything yet. So if he picks up a bird flying past our house, I'll have to put it in my monthly email.
Yeah, Mononkatuk installed a Modus tower at New Haven Harbor last fall, and we picked up two birds during fall migration.
Cool.
Or for more during the spring migration.
Yeah, Modus is really fantastic. It's growing all the time too.
We're also looking at some other technologies for tracking birds.
And Rebecca, I'm Robin. I'm the center director at the Bent to the River Audubon Center up in Southbury, Connecticut. And Dennis and I know and think very fondly of Jill Deppy.
Oh,
So it's really exciting that you've consulted with her. We also have a Modus tower. We've had about 36 separate individuals, mainly thrushes, come through. And it's been super interesting tracking their activities and learning more about where they're stopping over, and then hopefully some data on their wintering grounds. Fingers crossed. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
thank you. Yeah, I just got a message saying my internet connection is unstable, so I hope I'm not about to cut out or something, but at least I got through my talk. Yeah, the chapter in my book on radio telemetry is honestly my favorite one. That's where I talk about Bill Cochran and where I talk about Modus. And it was really fun to put together because I got to weave together the stories of Bill Cochran studying thrushes using like the earlier generation of radio telemetry in the 70s, with a young woman from Columbia studying the same species of thrush using Modus. So it was really fun.
Can't wait to dive into that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other
Nice
questions?
presentation, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Barbara says, love the history. Ordered the paperback. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Yeah, I barely scratched the surface of all the stories that are in the book. So if you liked this, there's a lot more.
Any other questions? Rebecca, thank you so much. No problems with the rescheduling. That was fine.
Okay.
And look forward to reading the book myself.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm very honored that 2 years after the book came out, I'm still getting invited to give talks about it. So this is great.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
Rebecca.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
I should